Hi, thanks, Donna. Yeah, as Donna said, my name is Amy Brisson. I am the Program Director for Research and Analytics at Enterprise Community Partners on our Knowledge, Impact, and Strategy team. I'm really excited to bring you this webinar today. It's hosted through our new Opportunity 360 initiative. I'm going to give a really brief introduction to Opportunity 360, and then I'm going to turn it over to our presenters to talk about the work that they've been doing using innovative tools and strategies to engage residents in their communities. So Opportunity 360, it's a new platform that Enterprise created to help our partners across various sectors better understand the communities that they work in and the opportunities offered in those places. It's grounded by our vision that every community is a community of opportunity where pathways to a better life are accessible to everyone. This was launched in the fall of 2017 at the Opportunity360.org website, which brings together a variety of tools and resources, including data visualizations and data exploration tools that are all designed to illuminate how opportunity-related factors play out across the country. It includes a comprehensive measurement framework that assesses outcomes for all residents across dimensions of housing stability, quality education, good health and well-being, economic security, and mobility. And you can check all of this out after the presentation. There's going to be an email that goes out with links to the site, as well as more information about some of the projects that we're going to be talking about today. So at Opportunity 360, we also recognize that quantitative measurement isn't everything. It's so important for communities to participate in telling their own stories and to ground the data that we have in their own experiences and solutions. So to that purpose, Opportunity 360 site highlights a number of tools and strategies for deeper community engagement aided by new technologies. For example, on this slide here, we're showing Esri's story mapping platform. This is one of the tools we highlight. We provide examples and information on how to use it, and we actually have a number of case studies, reports, and examples of these tools that we produce through a partnership with the University of Maryland National Center for Smart Growth and Radian, a nonprofit design group based in Denver. And Radian put together a series of case studies for us, looking at how different localities are incorporating data using a mix of both traditional and innovative tech-based engagement tools to work with their communities and build consensus around community solutions. So we have an opportunity today, luckily, to dig into some of those case studies. To lead that conversation, we have Ken Snyder, who is the Director of Programming at Radian. And I'm going to turn things over to Ken to let him introduce the panel. Ken?
All right, thank you. All right. Welcome, everyone, and thank you so much. And thanks, Amy, for the introduction. And so we're going to talk today about strategic frameworks and strategies for community revitalization. We have 3 case studies that we're going to be covering in today's webinar. The first one looks at creating communities and streetscapes that are walkable and bikeable. And that'll be in Denver, Colorado, where I live. The second one is going to be a case study about neighborhood revitalization in Detroit, Michigan. And then finally, we have a case study looking at the farm to school program in the statewide in the state of Vermont. We have a great set of panelists to talk to us, starting with me and Dan Shaw Dan Shaw's with the West Colfax Business Improvement District, and we'll be talking about Denver. Sarita Scott with the Community Development Associates of Detroit, and Jeff Ross with Data Driven Detroit. We'll talk about the Detroit project, and then we'll wrap up with Betsy Rosenthal with Vermont Feed. So with each of these projects, like Amy gave a great introduction to the resources and tools that are on the Opportunity 360 website, not to mention the excellent work that Enterprise Community Partners does. And each of these case studies definitely looks at how to improve equity issues in communities and how to improve access to opportunity. There's common elements in each of these case studies. An important part of it is collecting data and information about the current conditions, and also to understand trends and be able to make good decisions based on where things are and where things are headed. There's elements of iterative design and planning. We're looking at projects and thinking about how to make things better, particularly the frameworks that are designed with Detroit and Vermont. There's some really exciting and interesting information about how to kind of look at these complex issues and create a process that works well. And that the collaborative decision-making is key in each of these case studies. Different tools and techniques that folks use for outreach and engagement and bringing stakeholders into the process really are one of the reasons why we selected these projects when we were putting together the case studies. And that there are multiple benefits that we've seen with these comprehensive approaches around economic development and health and capacity building for neighborhoods and organizations. And again, a lot of the tools and techniques that are described in these case studies also can be found on the Opportunity 360 website. So I encourage you to keep visiting that site and looking at the stuff that they have to offer. So on that, we're going to jump right into each of the case studies. And I'll start out with a description of the project that Radian Place Matters was involved with the West Colfax Business Improvement District, and Dan Shaw will help wrap up talking about some of the successes of that project and where things are headed. So in terms of the Reimagine West Colfax, this project was to look at how to improve walkability and bike access in the community. It's an area that's a boulevard that's 26 miles long through Denver, and it's an area that has quite a heavy vehicle traffic. And one of the things, though, is there have been improvements around light rail and bus transit, trying to make sure that there are more people getting out of their car, using transit, but also walking and biking, and figuring out how to use that also as a way to revitalize some of the neighborhoods and the businesses along the boulevard. So with the Reimagine West Colfax, the first important part was to work with residents and the university and gain good understanding of the challenges that exist around walking and biking. We used a tool called Blockshops that was developed by Place Matters in partnership with Walk Denver, and that tool made it possible for us to do these walking audits and collect map survey information and photos of the pedestrian environment. One of the challenges in Denver is that because private residents and businesses are responsible for the maintenance of their sidewalk, the city itself is not collecting very much data about the quality of sidewalks, and the Walk Scope tool that we were using helped us have a much better understanding of the pedestrian infrastructure. And so that then was used to help create maps that were showing where people wanted to, where they preferred to walk and bike, where they saw challenges, where there was major deficiencies in the pedestrian infrastructure, but also to create a heat map of where there had been bike and pedestrian accidents, and so where the intersections were the most dangerous and where there was real need for changes. That information then became the basis for having a design workshop with the city, several city agencies, Public Works, the Regional Transportation District, and the Planning Department, as well as design professionals who were experts in how to improve pedestrian and bike infrastructure, and have a design workshop, a charrette, to identify what might be some of the improvements that could be done. The next key phase then was to test out those ideas and also to have an event, a street festival that would bring people to to the area that we're looking at some of the potential improvements and have an opportunity to celebrate the community with music and food, but also to test out different types of bike lanes and different types of added amenities for improving walkability in that area. In terms of the sort of key things to think about, the partners that were involved in this project, the way that the project was set up, it was important to have outreach to the community at the onset and have outreach efforts that included going to the neighborhood association meetings and the different the business improvement district meetings, get feedback from people on what were the things that they saw as priority issues and needs. At the same time, also reaching out and meeting with the city agencies that would be responsible for the implementation of proposed recommendations. Again, with the assessment part of the project, really understanding the conditions on the ground and figuring out where there was needed change. That was a really important part of the project overall. And then in terms of Engage, this is where we deployed a number of different tools. We, again, the walk scope tool was done in combination with this idea of a walk shop, where we send out a team of volunteers and we use that to collect data and for us to be able to map that out. Again, the design charrette was the way that we worked with the city experts, the city agencies, and the design experts. And then we also used different techniques like keypad polling during public meetings where people could vote and respond to different questions, as well as visual preference surveys. And then finally, that community event, which was a street festival, and an opportunity to do pop-up design, tactical urbanism, were key parts of that project. So overall, what we were able to do is combine the data, the maps, and the information and the recommendations from the city on what was possible, and turn that into a report that had sort of those key recommendations. I'm going to go ahead and hand it over to Dan to be able to talk further about sort of where the successes that came out of that project.
Well, yeah, and so as Ken is pointing out, I run the business improvement district there in West Colfax, which is a very bifurcated neighborhood by that avenue of heavy traffic. And, you know, one of the key aspects is engagement, and engagement was really proven out through this process, through those different steps, and, you know, ultimately culminated in that event where we were, you know, we saw, you know, more than 600 participants as measured by scoops of ice cream given out, at least. That's how we counted. And then, of course, surveys completed. We were able to test a number of concepts. And it was really interesting to see how people's perspective really changed, seeing the concepts deployed in the real world versus those visual preference surveys that Ken talked about, where initially people thought, you know, they would be fine with a regular unprotected bike lane, but then having experienced a protected bike lane, it was really clear that people had that preference for a protected bike lane. And we had, and the engagement also wasn't just the community and the community building that it brought about, but it was also with elected officials and administration officials, which attended and participated in the event. And that really helped us get toward implementation of the ideas that were being trialed that day, so that, you know, the director of public works, city councilmen were there. They saw what we did, and it really got us to the table and sort of able to use this as a very, you know, sort of a real world planning process, but one that also carried with it evidence of community support and cohesion, around the kinds of recommendations that were made, that were, what the recommendations of the report of the data. So ultimately, we were this evolved into a request for bond funding that was funded in November of last year, and about $5 million of that will go to West Colfax.
All right.
And there's the graphic showing the different support of bike lane as people saw things in play.
Thanks, Dan. All right. Well, great. So moving along, we're going to. Oh, I'm sorry, and we did have this slide that just helped show that. And Dan, you could speak to this even more, but the process that we put into action with this Reimagine West Colfax then has led to a number of projects in the region.
So all of our projects at this point, we've carried forward this idea of a tactical design and community-involved project. We implemented wayfinding in the Lakewood Gulch, for example, in multilingual wayfinding to connect West Colfax to an adjacent redeveloping neighborhood. And ultimately, that got us thinking about those connections with to that neighborhood and sort of the bigger obstacle to the connectivity, which is this major interchange-style intersection. So we're now actually just on June 3rd going to be doing another really pretty big design demonstration, tactical urbanist design demonstration, where we're going to be showcasing how that intersection would look like and function if it were reintegrating, if you could reintegrate the grid and better connect these neighborhoods, and then with the land uses that could and would bring about. So it's really had a big impact on how we've gone about looking at our projects, building community, and having fun at the same time, but also getting results with demonstrating political support, community support, building political support, and moving forward on projects.
All right, thank you. Okay, so next we're going to talk about the neighborhood revitalization efforts in Detroit, and again with Sarita Scott with the Community Development Advocates of Detroit, and then Jeff Ross with Data Driven Detroit. Sarita, are you there?
Ken, I'm afraid Sarita was not able to connect. Perhaps you could take over for her?
Yeah, just a second here. All right. Yeah, so with Detroit, and Jeff, definitely feel free to also pipe in, but with Detroit, we had there's a key component of looking at the fact that you had a number of vacant properties throughout the community and efforts for revitalization, thinking about that you're going to have a transformed landscape, and that some of the things that may be seen as huge problems can also be turned into opportunities if you think about the new some of the vacant properties and the ability to take those areas and turn them into community projects. So part of the key aspect of this effort was to be able to really understand the baseline conditions and the economic and natural resource elements of the community, and to be able to map out what's there, and then also identify what are the key strategies moving forward. The project was, particularly important in working at that neighborhood scale and working with a number of key groups on the ground, and working with a sort of have high level of expectation around making sure that you get huge participation by the community, and get their input on what are the kind of strategies and uses that they'd like to be able to use. And so, for example, with the Côte Rouge bioretention gardens, thinking about adding green infrastructure and to the community, and utilizing some of those key spaces. The key elements to think about in terms of the partnerships and the data and outreach efforts include sort of the working with the city, thinking about strategies that are region-wide, but then putting together neighborhood action plans that are very specific to the local neighborhood, and identify those key things that they're needed. So with Data-Driven Detroit, they played a key role, and Jeff will talk about some of the tools that were used with the project, but they were key at kind of helping understand that hyper-local aspect of the community, creating maps for the neighborhoods that show the details of the land use patterns and the key assets that exist in the community, the asset mapping and the resources that are available. And then also going through a pretty comprehensive level of engagement. And this next slide shows sort of, with the community stakeholder teams that they had in place, that there were different roles and responsibilities. The block groups were put together to help make sure that there were conversations with the different neighborhood leaders, and identifying the actions and how to implement that. At the neighborhood scale, with the neighborhood teams, you had folks going door to door, meeting and gathering places, the go-to-them strategy of meeting people at the laundromats and bus stations, and getting their input on what are their top concerns and issues, and how should that be translated into a neighborhood action plan. Providing those ideas and having that different community forums, taking advantage of the existing on the ground events, and then using that as an opportunity to reach out to the neighborhoods. And one of the key components of the process and approach was to make sure that people were able to see any of the recommendations that had emerged through the conversations, have time for them to see those, and then not publish any or finalize any of those actions or recommendations until it was pretty clear that there was broad community support. Pretty ambitious goal of having 10% of each of the neighborhoods be actively part of the conversation, and making sure that there was a strong representation. So those parts were key to the project. So with that, they were able to create these action plans that the neighborhoods owned and that they were able to start implementing on their own. But then within partnership with CDAD, they were able to then connect those ideas with the city agencies and the initiatives and resources at that city scale, and provide additional investment and support for those projects. So Jeff, I hand it over to you to talk a little bit more in detail about the community mapping tools and the techniques used to engage residents in the process.
Yes, thank you, Ken, for explaining all of that better than I could have, surprisingly. So the picture that you see on this slide here is the eventual online mapping tool that was created with this project, but it actually started out much more lo-fi than this. What Data-Driven Detroit did was take about 8 indicators to actually figure out what are the current conditions were on the ground, and one of those the things we're looking at actual physical structure condition that was attained through actually actually 2 parcel surveys, one in 2009 and one in 2013-14. That gave us our structure condition, and then we folded in other things like change in population, occupied homes, median housing value, and we created an index, and that index actually drives the color that you see on the map. On that map, you see the dark browns are your traditional residential neighborhoods, and the green is what is called urban homestead, so it's lower density, maybe even some urban agriculture, and then what's in between, the yellows are somewhere in between, but we're really looking at residential parcels here. And where we came in, of course, is in the mapping and doing the analysis, but we participated in community visioning sessions where we actually printed out, and I think maybe you could see one of those visioning sessions on the next slide. Printed out large-scale maps, and everyone in the neighborhood gathered around tables. These are actually look like some smaller-scale maps in that particular picture. Gathered around, and they actually looked at their neighborhood and said, "Are these current conditions that we've mapped out using data realistic? Is this what I believe my neighborhood actually looks like?" And surprisingly, the stats did pretty well, but sometimes we had to change some things because the numbers just couldn't actually tell the real picture. And once these current conditions were agreed upon, then we looked at future directions. And so we took that map and we took the current conditions, and then people decided what they want their neighborhood to look like in the future. So did they want that neighborhood to continue to be traditional residential? Did they think that it was more realistic or more desirable to be more urban homestead? And then we remapped everything on static maps, and that's what actually went into the final reports that were being used to create those plans that are being implemented now. And I think that pretty much sums up, I would say, the work that we put into this and really how we viewed those visioning sessions. You looked at, there was a lot of different they really had a broad reach in the community, and many of them were very well attended. And I see here the next slide here, we're looking at the neighborhood typologies, and that's exactly what the brown to the green to the yellow spectrum are, the different neighborhood typologies.
Yeah, and again, part of the key part of at the introduction was describing that you have neighborhoods where there's been quite a bit of transformation, and so, part of it is to build the expectation that we're not going to just rebuild neighborhoods to be the way that they were, but to actually take advantage of some of those changes and think about what are some ways to create new opportunities and new assets and resources. So food production, local food production has become one of the key elements of a lot of the neighborhood action plans. Where you're looking at, taking advantage of residential lots and making that, turning that into community gardens and ways to provide food locally. And then also that then can turn into other activities in terms of green venture and new sustainable businesses and enterprises. Some taking advantage of local food production, but also just other economic development opportunities that are very locally focused and looking at some of the key sort of neighborhood needs and issues. With that, then also, overall, there's an impressive network that's been put together. 80 citywide partners involved in designing the strategic framework. Looking at again, over 10% of each neighborhood involved. So. In each of the neighborhoods, they were able to meet with over 500 residents as part of the process of developing the neighborhood plans, and then creating a network of organizations. This again is one of the resources that also Enterprise with their Opportunity 360 website, some great resources that help collect information about local networks, local organizations that can be an important part of revitalization of neighborhoods. So at the time of writing the case study, 5 neighborhoods have developed neighborhood plans and are on their well into the implementation of those plans, and additional ones are becoming queued up in the area. So, and I guess just I'll go back to that slide just momentarily, just to say that there's some great resources on the CDAD online website and Data Driven Detroit. Any closing remarks, Jeff?
No, I don't think so. But if there's any interest in, additional information, as mentioned, our website has a Ask D3 feature, and you can just email us at using that function, and we can answer any additional questions about the analysis or the methodology.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you.
All right. So our third case study is on the Vermont Farm to School Network. How did that music pipe in? So Betsy, are you on the line?
Yeah, thanks, Ken. Can you guys hear me?
Yes.
Great. So I'm going to tell the story of the Vermont Farm to School Network. I work for a farm to school project called Vermont Feed, which is a partnership of two nonprofits, Shelburne Farms and the Northeast Organic Farming Association of Vermont. We were created in 2000, but by 2009, we partnered with the Vermont Agency of Agriculture to launch a farm-to-school network statewide to support the number of schools that were interested in this idea of farm-to-school and to address the challenges of childhood hunger and nutrition, farm viability, and education outcomes. So I serve as the backbone support for this network. And since 2009, the network has had this ambitious vision for spreading farm to school to every community in Vermont by 2020. And the vision was to engage every student and community in a food and farm culture that nurtures child health, cultivates viable farms, and builds vibrant communities. But we had no concrete plan how we were going to actually realize that vision. So we had lots of activity across the state, on the ground, in schools, with partners, but not necessarily alignment on the priorities that were going to get us there. So in 2014, we used a strategic mapping process to help us figure out how we were going to get there to create systems-level change to get to our vision and to reorganize our network for taking collaborative action. And instead of working town by town or school by school, we really needed farm to school to go viral. And in order to go viral, we knew we had to work together in a very coordinated and strategic way. So over the course of a year, we engaged 60 stakeholders and 35 organizations. We mapped out, I think we're one slide, you're one slide ahead of me, that's all right. We mapped out the farm to school system, and that turned out to have about 180 different people, policies, and programs that all impact the farm to school system. We identified one shared time-specific measurable goal that sets the magnitude and direction of our work, and used that process to identify 4 key levers of change, and then created 5 strategies based on those levers. And I would just note that I think it's hard to affect change at this scale statewide without some systems-level analysis and aligning all the stakeholders to go towards the same shared goal. And for us, this process began, and we still use this idea of individual alignment. So we began with the question simply, what is the change you're trying to cause? And then how can Farm to School help you with that? And in that way, that collaboration works because people keep that principle in mind and they put in the time and stay engaged if they know that collectively it will further their own personal or organizational goals. And then the next slide, I just want to make the point, we've got these 5 strategic action teams in the network. About 35 to 40 folks are engaged on the action teams around each of the 5 or 4, we broke it out into 5 levers. And those teams meet, and then all the teams together meet every 6 months to reflect on learning, share our learning across the teams, adjust our strategies based on that, and set a new target for the next 6 months. And through this process, we've had a tremendous amount of work and action. And this is going from a network more hierarchical with a steering committee of 12 that really things would get bottlenecked, and there was a lot of sort of discord about what direction collectively would go in. And now we've got people on the ground deciding projects, being part of projects that really align with what they're trying to achieve. And we've completed a report on the economic contribution of farm to school. We were able to measure for every dollar that schools spend on local purchasing, $1.60 is contributed to the economy. And so there's a couple $1 million coming back from that investment. We weren't able to measure the educational benefits, so we used digital storytelling to collect bright spots and be able to share that with other decision makers. We passed a state farm to school bill that expanded farm to school, included early care and education, and tripled the state funding. And the supply team, we've got these 5 teams, continues to look at just measuring the size of the market opportunity for some key products that schools are buying and scaling that up with producers in Vermont. So those are just a few highlights. There's a lot more. If we want to look at the key elements, it really depended on bringing a very diverse network of stakeholders together. So we included our anti-hunger organizations, state agencies, funders, school nutrition staff, parents, educators, farmers, all to align around this common goal, and now to share in the decision-making and leadership of the network. It's really a self-managing structure in a lot of ways. With assessment, we use this protocol that I described. We call it Align, Act, Adjust, that we align around the next strategy and every 6 months come back together to learn and adjust for the next 6 months. And we're engaging stakeholders at multiple levels. The next slide kind of breaks that out. I'm not going to walk through everyone, but we do have a steering committee. We call it the Common Circle, which coordinates communication, and it's comprised of a representative from each of the action teams to help in doing that. And that group also collaboratively allocates funding for the network. And we still have a grassroots network of over 400 folks on our listserv that participate in various ways, whether it's trainings or events or any one of our grassroots campaigns for decision makers, contacting legislators and school board members, organizing programs in their schools, and all of that. The next slide talks a little bit more about action. And it's these various levels where people are can align with where they feel they can make the impact, whether it's on the steering committee level, the Common Circle, or within their own school. But we've got clarity about what we're working towards. And so I feel like there were these, through our process, these 3 key opportunities about getting collectively clear about what the network was going to work on, and meaning the members of the network, using the process really to build trusting working relationships across the system, and that's really aided by transparent communication at every step. And then third, being able to really quickly demonstrate with a minimum of risk our ability to move the needle, right? This whole collective impact approach, which then builds our momentum and embeds in this shift in the way we now work collaboratively. And so, for example, when we finished our strategic mapping process and organized the teams, we were immediately able to give each team a seed grant, a small seed grant of maybe $1,500 for those teams to immediately move into action and start to build momentum. And the teams used that to organize around larger projects, which funders then saw how strategic they were and how clear, the clarity of the direction we were going in. And each of those 5 projects were then invested with grants. And then our last grant came to the network as a whole to say, you know best how to allocate that funding to projects. And we had built enough consensus and with clarity around our direction to allocate that. And I would say, 5 years ago, we just couldn't have done that well. And so that has really made a big difference for us in terms of that momentum. If you follow the 5 key points of collective impact, these graphics sort of indicate that we do have a common agenda with our shared goal that's stated below there, that 75% of Vermont schools will have integrated food system education and nourishing meals, purchasing 50% from sustainable regional sources by 2025. So that's what we're all pointing towards in each of our roles. And we've got these mutually reinforcing activities through our action team projects. I could talk more about transparent communication, the way that we have some standing calls, a listserv, shared folders for people to, at any point, get the information they need of what's happening across the network. A strong backbone support. And again, I'm really there to communicate, not to, on a part-time basis, not play a major role leading the effort. And shared measurement. So we do have a set of shared metrics to measure progress towards our goal. And lastly, just in terms of some of the outcomes, we have at this point about 93% of schools buying at least some kind of Vermont product. It's really the size of that purchasing that we're trying to increase. About 75% of our schools have gardens, school gardens, and about almost two-thirds of the schools have taste testing of new foods. And we know that students are most likely to eat vegetables and fruits and healthier foods with the changes in the cafeteria and the hands-on learning. For example, this is a picture of our Junior Iron Chef competition winners. That's a culinary competition that has had about 3,000 teams over the 10 years competing, and they cook and serve in the State House to legislators. And for us, it's really elevating the voice of youth to be able to talk about the change in the food system themselves. And the next slide is another summary of some of the other impacts. One other point I would just mention, and we're happy to answer other questions to go into more detail, is that for us, our goal has been to simultaneously encourage schools to move forward with farm to school and expanding access to and participation in school meal programs. And over a 5-year period, childhood hunger declined 37% in Vermont, while adult hunger declined only about 17%. And we really attribute a major part of that is with the growth and expansion of school nutrition programs along with farm to school and the strong partnership that we have through this network with those mutual goals. So I might stop there and happy to dive into anything more in more detail.
Excellent. Thank you very much. And thank you to all the panelists for their presentations. And again, there's a 3-page write-up of each of these case studies available on the Opportunity 360 website. So you can read a little bit more about the details there. And Amy and Donna, because my computer is in presentation mode, I can't see the questions coming in. Are you able to help highlight some of the questions that the participants have for our panelists?
Absolutely. We've definitely gotten in some good questions. And before I start reading them out, just a reminder, if you have questions, you can type them into the Q&A panel, which is at the bottom right-hand side of your screen. And please address them to all panelists. That way we can all see them and I can read them out loud. And regarding the case studies that Ken just referenced, when this session is over in approximately 48 hours. All attendees will be receiving a link to the archive, which will contain not only a copy of the recording of this session and most likely of the slides, but we'll also have a link to those case studies so you can read them on the Opportunity 360 site. And with that, let's get started with some questions. One of the first ones that came in was, what were the most successful strategies to recruit volunteers for the Walkshop walk audits? And how did you make sure you were engaging typically underrepresented populations throughout this process?
Yeah, that's a great question. And first of all, one of the important things that we did is we worked with an organization here in Denver, Groundwork Denver. They have a national representation, and they have chapters throughout the country. But Groundwork Denver was able to help us do door-to-door outreach, and so we made sure to put flyers at every door in Spanish and English to get the word out. So that, in addition to the social network platforms and the fact that there's quite a few people that follow the Facebook page for the neighborhoods, and then also there's the with the business improvement district and the businesses along Colfax, having them put up flyers and spread the word. But most importantly was putting flyers on every door throughout the neighborhood and knocking on doors and getting people involved, and attending those community meetings where we let people know what we're up to and inviting them to be part of the street festival and the activities.
Great, thank you, Ken. Next question is, I would be interested to hear from all project leads, if trust needed to be reestablished with the community, how did you do that? And two, to what extent power was shared with the community? Who was at the table when final decisions were made?
Well, I would just say a few quick things. This is Betsy. We had to have enough incentive to get people to the table to start to build that trust. And so we began with just individual interviews so that people felt comfortable just sharing their perspective individually, one-on-one. And then we moved into focus groups so that, in this case, school nutrition professionals had a lot to say. So as a group, it was a little more comfortable then to share with each other what some of those issues were, what some of their concerns and their hopes were for the process. And then we moved into larger meetings where across the different sectors, we were able by then to have built enough trust to get into some, more deeper conversations that would have been less comfortable had we started with those.
This is Dan Shaw from West Colfax BID, and I think that the process that we embarked on, it really helped us. The way in which people are really involved in different facets of the process all along the way, from sort of the keypad polling on different concepts for enhanced crossings to but actually then participating as volunteers in creating the built, the one-day design demonstration. People really love that. I mean, they love, we had the funding, with Radian and Place Matters to shut down the street, and they really love just occupying the street like that. Just being able to take ownership of it, paint it, things like that. We used that again in another art crosswalk project, and people just really find that to be a really meaningful thing. I think that really has helped our ability to reach sort of a greater number of people in the neighborhood that are, that are representative of the diversity in the neighborhood, sort of to that first question. I think that those kinds of things really matter. I think that in the end, the fact that that they're involved all along the way gives people the very real sense that they are part of the process that is resulting in a recommendation, rather than something that seems to, in most planning processes, it's a sort of a, people have the feeling, and maybe the reality is that it's a predetermined outcome. They're asked to come to a meeting, and that's about it. This is a much more intensive level of participation that gives people a sense of that their input is real.
Yeah, and I'll just go ahead and jump on the tail end of what Dan was talking about, just to describe that with the pop-up design and tactical urbanism, that there are a couple of things that are advantageous to that. In terms of having it as part of a street festival and have it out in the open, is that it's disruptive in sort of a nice way. It creates a bunch of things for people to look at, and you get people involved that normally you'd never see at a town meeting, but because you're in their normal day-to-day walking space, they can't help but take notice and then become drawn into a conversation about what it's about and what works and doesn't work. But also that experimentation is really helpful for the city. It allows them to think about things that they might not try otherwise, but see how well it works in a specific place. But also, is there enough community buy-in that if they put in a new bicycle lane or make some changes, will they have the buy-in and support for that type of infrastructure? And so it gives the city a little bit of a way to experiment with that and get good feedback.
Okay, let's move on to our next question. And this one comes for, let's see, I think this one is going to be going to Betsy. For Farm to Table, what were some of the challenges you faced when corralling all of the interested parties? And what part of your process do you think was most successful at building that tribe?
Mm-hmm. That's a good question. I would say I really feel like that building from individual alignment to the group helped bring people along. And so people who individually maybe felt like they didn't have much to do with Farm to School, by the end of this conversation and looking at the systems map and how we're all, some people are systems thinkers, it's really easy. Others, it was completely confusing to look at this map, which you can find on our website, by the way. But you could understand the interaction of all the pieces as they came together. And so even though you might be working at a food hub in the supply chain, just trying to get more local product out, it really depends on the folks working with the food service on the skills and the equipment and the capacity building. You got to see those connections. I think that really helped quite a bit to understand how much farther collectively we were going to get than individually. I think there was a lot of resistance around another big strategic planning process because there had been so many. And so it was critical for us, as I mentioned, to move very quickly to taking action, even small action, so people could see that this can translate into making a difference on the ground, whether it's development of resources or research or tools or whatever the different teams are working on. And
Betsy, we have a follow-up question here. In Vermont, we talked about moving the needle. What are the measures and how do we peg the needle at a particular point and then set goals for moving it?
That's a great question. It's certainly been, I would say, one of our bigger challenges is agreement around a shared set of metrics. And so we ended up creating actually an entire evaluation team to bring different ideas to the table and then settle on a set of metrics. And then we've got the Department of Health, the Agency of Agriculture, and the Agency of Education collaborating on a survey of every school in the state to measure directly our goal in terms of first defining what integrated food system education is and how to create a bit of an index for schools of where they are and to measure that across the state and as a baseline, and then to come back and see over time if that shifts. So, and the same with local purchasing and other components, food access, et cetera. So we've got that underway, and I think it was the close working relationship with the state agencies that really helped with that. What's been harder is for the teams to identify specific metrics for their team level goals, for the goals around their levers. And so we're still working on that. We've been asking the team, I think we've got to give them more support to figure out how they could measure the needle shifting over time.
Great, thank you.
This is Ken. I just wanted to tack on that, I think it's really helpful to have metrics that show the interconnection of these issues. And for farm to school, the connection between hunger and poor nutrition and how that affects education and health. That one stat that you guys have of a 72% decrease in nurse visits in the schools that have the universal meals is just, a really good example of that, where getting people food and having less kids hungry during the day can, have that tremendous impact.
Excellent, thank you. We're almost at time. I'm going to try to squeeze in one last question here because it's a really good question. And that is, here in Houston, we're beginning large-scale community engagement around the over $1 billion in housing recovery money from Harvey. What is your advice about the early stages of community engagement and how to build trust while still solidifying approaches and methods?
Wow, that is a good one, and it's a huge project, an effort, and critical in terms of getting that outreach to happen and work. It would be great if Sarita was on the line to talk a little bit about what they've done in Detroit. But I think part of the structure that they set up is a really good thing to emulate, which is you have these efforts that are very locally based, where the neighborhoods are able to work in that smaller sort of geographic scale with the mapping that Data-Driven Detroit was able to do to also help people kind of think about these issues at that scale, and then to also make that an opportunity to create an action plan or ideas that are maybe local in their sort of unique approach, and yet can be tied to citywide efforts. But making sure that there's that framework where it ties to those city programs and resources. But that we found when we've done outreach and engagement efforts at a citywide or regional scale, that sometimes it can become a lot more difficult to get people to the table or to participate in the conversation. So if there are ways to have a combination of the local outreach and working with neighborhood groups, and then combining that with regional efforts, that seems to help a lot. Others have additional responses to that question?
Ken, it sounds like you covered it. And with that, I hate to say it, but we are at time. Just a reminder that when you leave this session, you will be taken to a very brief questionnaire, and we would love to get your feedback. It really helps us to keep these webinars as useful and informative for you as possible. We promise it's a short one. And with that, I would like to say a very big thank you to Amy and Ken and Dan and Jeff and Betsy. And hope that you enjoyed today's webinar, and we very much hope to see you here again at another webinar from Opportunity 360. Goodbye.
Yeah, thank you, everyone.